A former member of Bangkok Symphony Orchestra, Dr. Sallynee has finished master degree in violin performance from the Hart School and a master's and doctorate degree in early music performance from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where she currently resides. She is an active chamber and orchestral musician in North America, where she performs exclusively on the Baroque violin. So please welcome Miss Dr. Sallynee.
Okay, is this okay? All right. In the last few decades, historical performance practice has moved from the fringes into a more mainstream approach to classical musical performance. Its early focus was on Renaissance and Baroque repertoire, but more recently, interest has begun to shift towards classical and early Romantic repertoire. Primary sources offer insight into the different performance practices of these two eras, but changes in musical style, form, and function evolved over time, some more radically, most of them not. Therefore, there exists a transitional or gray period during the mid-18th century in which there occurs a metamorphosis of style, and decisions in performance practice need to take into account both old aesthetics and new. Today, I will discuss the Sonatas for Violin and Bass Opus 3, composed in 1764 by French violinist Pierre Gavinier as a case study of transitional repertoire. I will address 3 questions related to the performance practice of these sonatas. How did the articulation markings, such as the slur, evolve from the high Baroque to the early classical period? Do these developments influence the choice of bow type? Do these articulations possibly reflect the influence of new types of bows and instruments, such as the forte piano, in Paris? During the 18th century, Paris was an epicenter for musical arts and for the founding of the French violin school. Having evolved from a band instrument in 17th century France, the violin now held important roles as a solo, chamber, and orchestral instrument in Paris. In 1725, the inception of the Concert Spirituel at the Palais de Toury was the first public concert series in existence and provided a new platform for both local and foreign composers and virtuosos. This series continued until 1790 and also helped to promote Italian music to Parisian audiences who loved flashy and virtuosic styles of sonatas and concertos. As a result, violinist composers began to push the boundaries of violin technique in order to impress Parisian audiences. New innovations and a more virtuosic style of solo playing emerged as each performer tried to outplay the other. Our featured composer, Pierre Gavinier, made his career in Paris and later was to become one of the first violin instructors at the Conservatoire de Musique in Paris in 1795. Born on May 11, 1728, he made his debut at the Concert Spirituel at age 13, and from 1748, Gavinier performed there regularly as a soloist and chamber musician. In 1760, Gavinier published his much-anticipated Opus 1 set of violin sonatas. His Opus 3 were published 4 years later, and several of his symphonies, now lost, were performed at the Concert Spirituel between 1762 and 63. In 1764, 6 concertos for solo violin and orchestra were also published, in addition to his Opus 3 violin sonatas. In the 1730s, violinist composers frequently used dots, strokes, slurs, and combinations thereof to indicate various types of bowing articulation. These markings can be found in the violin sonatas of French composer Jean-Marie Leclerc and his contemporaries, such as in these examples. Longer slurs over articulated notes, such as the slurred tremolo and slurred staccato, are commonly found in these sonatas. However, the interpretation of these markings is often unclear and left to the discretion of the performer. musicologist Robin Stoll states that the ambiguity of 18th century notation makes it difficult to know exactly how these articulations were performed, but tempo, character, and context form the basis of interpretation. Both slurred staccato and tremolo are indicated when repeated notes are under a slur, as in this example from Leclerc's Sonata No. 2, Opus 5, which is the top example there. The tempo indication andante and the absence of dots or strokes indicate the use of slurred tremolo in this case. So that the articulation that's bracketed in red would probably be something like so this type of bow stroke, we also often hear it described as a bowed vibrato. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the second example has this, it's a similar articulation marking, but with dots, and it would be interpreted as a staccato. And this example is from the Allegro in Guillemein's Sonata No. 1, second movement Allegro. So this one would be sort of a more sort of, what we would be more familiar as a spiccato bow stroke now. So it's worth it to note that you might assume that because there are dots under the slur, as in the Guillemin example, there are often dots under slurs in a slow movement as well. So this is what Robin Stoll is saying, in that context is always extremely important when interpreting these markings. Gaviniè's use of articulation markings and slurs becomes much more prescriptive in his Opus 3 sonatas, and we begin to see a transition in the use of bowings and phrasings. We still see a similar use in combination dots or strokes with slurs, such as in his earlier works, but over longer gestures. His use of slurs alone is distinctly different from earlier composers. Slurs over entire bars or more appear in every sonata in Opus 3, which was unusual during the Baroque period, but much more common in the classical and Romantic repertoire. He also uses long slurs over smaller ones, as in these examples from Sonata 5, which is this one here. Oops. So here you see, if you can see, it's not very clear, but you have a slur, a long slur, but over each of the, you can call them triplet figures, there's smaller slurs. So this is sort of to kind of give direction to the performer that rather than interpreting these smaller slurs as individual gestures, to more make it a longer line, which is sort of, you know, we're now heading into the classical style of longer phrasing. So these slurs, they also reflect Gaviniè's development of the cantabile, or singing style. The aim of this aesthetic during the mid-18th century was to mimic the singing style of the human voice, and as a result, longer phrases over a relatively simple bass line are typical in his sonatas. Treatises during the second half of the 18th century discussed the use of legato bow strokes within this context. In his treatise, L'Abbé Le Fils recommended using finger movement to effect a smooth change, but a true legato with a pre-torte bow was most effectively achieved through use of slurs. So I interpret L'Abbé Le Fis's comment about finger movement as when you're using a period bow such as this one, you have quite a difference of tension from here to the end. So if I were to play this figure here, just sort of naturally, without any compensation, it would be something like, sorry. So you have 4 very distinct short gestures, but if I were to use finger motion to sort of smooth it out, you can achieve a smoother long, something like that. In other words, because of the earlier styles of bows, we often had to compensate physically in order to achieve these longer phrases. Detailed articulation, and especially the use of longer slurs, is definitely a point of consideration when choosing a bow type. In Gaviniè's case, his career was centered in Paris, which, as we mentioned before, was the epicenter for musical arts, but also innovations in instrument construction. In the 1780s, French bowmaker François Torte developed a model that would become the standard of modern players today. Previously, length and weight of typical Baroque-style bows varied considerably during the first half of the century. This selection of bows from the Hill collection at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford illustrates the variation of bow types from around 1700 to 1820. They range from the pike's head Baroque sonata bows to the battle axe head transitional types that became the standard of the Torte models. In 1798, Parisian violinist Michel Voldemar discussed 4 bow types which were associated with performers who favored them. He claimed that the battle axe head model, associated with the London virtuoso Wilhelm Kramer, was adopted during the 1770s and 80s by a majority of artists and amateurs. So this would be referring to any of these models starting from here, where the head, the tip of the bow starts to change. So you see different variations on the shape of these tips because, as you can also see, there's also a change in the curvature of the stick. So modifications to the tip had to have been made in order to adjust for this change in the curve. So variations on this model here were being produced in France by Torte-Père and the Duchesne family, and a similar model with the hatchet head was developed by Torte-Père a decade earlier. These models had relatively the longest playing length of bows prior to the 19th century, but use of these bow types was relatively slow in the years leading up to the French Revolution. Their exact manner of execution was only examined in detail in 1803 in the Méthode de violon by Rode, Bayeux, and Kreutzer in 1803. So I'll just show you. So this is actually a replica of a 1725 long sonata bow. So it's very similar to this first model up here, which is from around 1700. So this is sort of typically what we would use to play the Baroque repertoire. So, for example, Corelli, Rameau, Lully, all of the sort of early Baroque. As we move into the mid-18th century and even into the third quarter, so this is a replica of a 1760 Duchesne transitional bow. So this is very similar to the Kramer bow, which is something like this one here. This is a model by Torte-Père, also from 1760. So I think it's important to note when you select, for string players, when selecting a bow, often we, when we're trying to play something historically, we hear Mozart, we hear Haydn, and we automatically go for this sort of classical type bow. But actually, this type of bow is not until much, much later, 1820. So, and most of us in here are musicians, and as we all know, investing in instruments can be quite an expensive endeavor. So you can imagine that most musicians at the time probably were not so eager to buy all sorts of new bows, especially as they were being experimented with. So actually, when playing Haydn or Mozart, something like an earlier transitional bow like this would have been much more appropriate, and actually not unheard of to play it on a Baroque bow as well. And I have played Haydn symphonies on a Baroque bow, and it is quite the experience, and it does produce quite a different sound than what we're used to hearing, of course. But anyway, this is a discussion for another time. But just a point to bring up in terms of string players when choosing your bows, always think much further back than you would imagine. So in choosing the type of bow that I use to interpret these Gaviniès sonatas, this is sort of going to contradict what I just said, but I believe that the execution of the cantabile movements need to be considered more than the shorter staccato articulations. Published in 1760s, these sonatas could have been performed with a variety of the long sonata bows, such as this one. In a realistic sense, I could play every single sonata with this bow. But when I tried using it with the later model, it was very, very different. His use of longer phrasing and wider range of dynamics could also have been influenced by changing aesthetics in keyboard instruments. The clavichord and fortepiano were beginning to gain popularity in Paris, favored for their wider dynamic range and expressivity. This timeline shows the early history of fortepianos in Paris. Gavinier was acquainted with pianist Johann Gottfried Eckhardt, a German pianist who settled in Paris in the late 1750s. In 1763, Eckhardt published the Six Sonates pour le clavecin, or the Six Sonatas for the Harpsichord, Opus 1. This collection was dedicated to Gavinier. While the title page specifies the clavecin, or the harpsichord, the preface reads, "I have sought to make these works equally suitable for the harpsichord, the clavichord, and the forte piano. It is for this reason that I felt obliged to indicate piano and forte quite often, which would have been pointless had I only the harpsichord in mind." So in this, he's referring to his use of dynamics. As we can see, he indicates piano and forte relatively more frequently than other works that were published during that time. And this is, dynamic range is something that is not quite possible on a harpsichord, but due to the mechanism of the fortepiano, you can get a much more subtle difference in dynamic range. As Howard Schott states in his article, From Harpsichord to Pianoforte, A Chronology and Commentary, it is likely that musicians of the day were not preoccupied with historical authenticity in the same way that scholars and performers of early music are today. And this was mentioned earlier, but public and private concerts would have used whatever instruments were available at that particular location and occasion. During this period, it's possible that a violinist may have performed an old-fashioned Corelli sonata and a fashionably modern accompanied keyboard sonata by Mozart in the same evening. Despite Gavinier having added figures to the accompanying bass line, it is possible that they could have been performed on a hammer-action keyboard if one was available and the accompanist was able to realize the figures. Expanding on our earlier timeline, we find further evidence of fortepianos in the 1760s. In 1766, a fortepiano is listed in the estate inventory of a well-known family of harpsichord makers in Paris. The Blanchet workshop was one of the first to build fortepianos in Paris, as the prominent harpsichordist Claude Benin Belbastre was known to have owned a Blanchet piano in 1763. Finally, in 1768, the fortepiano is introduced at the Concert Spirituel. By 1785, the series featured only one harpsichordist, but no less than 12 pianists. The sustained sound of the fortepiano could have made an excellent accompaniment to the long phrases and slurred articulations of the violin line in Gavinier's sonatas, particularly in the cantabile movements. Coupled with a longer bow, perhaps a sound such as Galeazzi described in 1791 could be achieved. There's nothing more difficult than to play a cantabile slowly and well. The song of the human voice must be imitated as closely as possible. If the voice is not to be thought asthmatic or broken, smooth bow changes must be made in order that the melody emerges united and not broken. This unity can be obtained by changing the bow as little as possible, and now and then, by bowing the entire musical idea in one stroke. In fact, not a little skill is required in changing the bow so that the change may be scarcely discernible. In my research of these sonatas, I experimented with using both harpsichord and fortepiano as basso continuo instruments. So again, even though the fortepiano was not known as a continuo instrument, they coexisted at the same time, and there was, amongst those performers that may have been sort of more on the exploratory side and open to the fortepianos in Paris, it's possible that some could have been using the fortepiano playing these sonatas. The harpsichord was the initial choice as the most logical instrument to play figured bass, but the idea of using the fortepiano came from a desire to have a more sustained accompaniment. Artistic decisions in phrasing and dynamics were made in initial rehearsals with the harpsichord, then transferred or translated to the fortepiano. From my perspective, longer phrasing and all of the cantabile movements were much more comfortable with the fortepiano, especially in passages that required sustaining sound and direction over a bass line punctuated by rests, as in the second movement. So if you see in the bass line, even though it's a cantabile movement, the bass line is actually quite rather short and jumpy in some places. So I invite you to listen to this experiment that I did. There will be two versions of this movement, one played with the harpsichord and one played on a fortepiano. But both of them I am using a transitional bow. So for those of you that are sensitive to these things, I apologize for the discrepancy in pitch. The harpsichord is tuned at A415 and the fortepiano is at A430. So, in conclusion, how did the use of articulation markings such as the slur evolve from the High Baroque to the early Classical period? Lengths of slurs became longer, indicating longer phrases, and the development of a more cantabile style of playing, especially in slow movements. Do these developments influence the choice of bow type? Absolutely. Longer phrasing is best achieved with a longer bow length and a more equal distribution of tension along the stick, which helps to produce smooth bow changes and a more uniform sound. And finally, do these articulations possibly reflect the influence of new types of bows and instruments such as the forte piano in Paris? In a holistic sense, yes. Musical aesthetics are evolving parallel to innovations in instrument construction as well as instrument technique. Flexibility in instrumentation, or at least an openness to flexibility in instrumentation, is a key to interpreting works from the mid to late 18th century. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for information about performance practice on Baroque violins. Do you have any questions?
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question not so much about the cantabile approach in the law, but what your thoughts are about when you actually have, you started with that example with the slurred articulation.
Yes.
Of that. And I noticed in your playing that you lifted the 12th string through those. So there's a kind of argument going on at the moment about what would have happened in the Baroque period in terms of staccatos. Did they lift the 12th string or not? And where does that information come from if they did lift it off the string? I'm quite keen to know what you think about that and if you've read anything that...
I think that I haven't come across any evidence from primary sources that sort of have solidified my opinion one way or the other. I think just in terms of, I mean, for sure, I think nowadays, we are all trained as modern violinists, Yes. Exactly. So we do tend to sort of fall back on these sort of traditional ways of playing. But I think also it depends on I think it's a character as well. Sometimes if I am playing a shorter bow stroke, I don't lift the bow. Sometimes I do. And I think that's a choice, a personal choice and an artistic choice that I feel comfortable making because I think somebody mentioned this earlier this morning that if I have a musical idea, I need to get it across. And I find that it's with the decreased tension in these earlier bows, also playing on gut strings, but you're playing in a big hall,
Yeah.
I mean,
I understand.
Yes. Yeah.
This is the sort of discussion that we always have.
Right.
Depending on where you're playing, etc., you might have to modify.
Yes.
In order to, I just wondered if you had, if you'd come across some information that we haven't, because it's.
I'm afraid to quote anything without being sure, but there is a sort of late 18th century treatise by Cartier, where he talks about it's an up bow staccato type bow stroke, and he does talk about sort of lifting the bow. So even if earlier in the 18th century it may have been not so much, that I think that in this repertoire they have started using a more lifted bow stroke.
The interesting thing is that when you get to the 19th century, Tischbor,
Yes.
it's a very on the bow sort of thing. So that's just
Yeah.
understanding what happened.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.